As a warning to our listeners, some of the details of this crime can be disturbing and very graphic.
I've always had a mother's instinct that he was the one that murdered my son.
12 years ago, a young couple headed out for a Saturday night with their friends and never returned. On January 6, 2007, 21-year-old Channon Christian and her boyfriend, 23-year-old Chris Newsom, were carjacked, and they ended up in a house of horrors on Chipman Street.
When I look at his pictures now, all I can think of is what they've done to my beautiful boy.
Her smile would light up a room. It didn't matter where she was. She was beautiful. And it wasn't just on the outside.
It's now been more than 12 years since the torture-slayings, and now the trial of Eric Boyd, one of the men involved, is about to begin. I'm Leslie Ackerson. I'm a reporter with WBIR Channel 10.
I'm John North. I'm an investigative reporter, and I'll be also sitting in on the trial.
John, there's a lot of information, a lot of details in this case. It's extensive. It's gone on for years. And with this podcast today, we really just mainly want to focus on what is connecting Boyd to the case and what we can really expect from his upcoming trial.
Right, Leslie. The people of Knox County have gone through so far 6 state trials, 4 regular trials, 2 retrials, and 1 federal trial for Eric Boyd. They are about to go through an 8th trial now, and this will be the one where Boyd actually stands trial in the killings. The first trial that he sat in in a federal court was for hiding Davidson. Now, 12 years later, authorities are saying, we've got enough proof to show he took part in the killings.
And Boyd has long been suspected of being a help in these killings. It's been a thought that's been on the family's mind, people involved in the case. They've been waiting for this.
One of the big reasons is that we heard early on, not in trials, but we heard through police interviews and through Talvez Cobbins testifying that he put Eric Boyd in the house that night, and he says Eric Boyd helped in the carjacking. But we've never had Boyd stand trial for that yet.
Boyd is facing charges of kidnapping, rape, and murder in both deaths of Channon Christian and Chris Newsom. John, let's kind of revisit the attack that night, go back over the details. It was late January 6th that we know. Chris and Shannon were headed out to hang out with some friends, and they were carjacked by a group of men.
They were expected at a party by about 10 o'clock, and they were hanging out at an apartment complex called the Washington Ridge Apartments, off of Washington Pike in Knoxville. As it turned out, kind of a coincidence, Lamarcus Davidson, who would go on to be the ringleader of the killings, had an errand to run in that same apartment complex. So he ends up going over there, we think, with Cobbins and Boyd, and they see Shannon and Chris kissing by Shannon's vehicle. They immediately decide, here's people we want to carjack, and that's what happens.
And really, this just escalated into what would be a terrible night for this young couple in Knoxville. Within hours, Chris was already dead in a really terrible manner.
They took him back to, that's right, they took him back to Lamarcus's rental house, a small little house, basically sort of North Knoxville, East Knoxville, on the border there, in a bad neighborhood, cheap house. They took him back to Davidson's house and immediately took Shannon back to a bedroom where they held her, and then a couple of the men walked off with Chris. And by now it's about midnight, and the horrors are about to start. There's no exaggeration here when you say that these were torture slayings, that this really was a horrifying experience. I mean, it's through the many trials that we've had, people have fainted trying to listen to the details of what happened to the 2 victims. There is a reason why the state of Tennessee sought to execute Lamarcus Davidson. It's because these crimes really were horrible. We can start with Chris. Chris, of course, was killed pretty quickly after he and Shannon were carjacked. They took his shoes. Lamarcus Davidson actually ended up being found with those shoes a couple days later. They took Chris's new shoes. They made him walk barefoot through the mud. It had been raining that night. He was raped, and he was then bound. His feet were tied. His hands were bound. His head was wrapped up. He had a blindfold. He was shot 3 times, once in the back, once while leaning over into the neck, and then also the last and very quickly fatal shot. A small caliber handgun was put against his right temple, and he died immediately from that gunshot. And the families of Chris and Shannon, Mary and Hugh Newsom, Gary and Dina Christian, had to listen to all of these details again and again and again.
They made him walk down through there barefooted on that cold night or morning, mud and everything else, before they tied his ankles together with his own belt and then basically shot him in the back. Now that is a real coward
They're
act.
all cowards,
And
every one of them.
Who would shoot a helpless young man with his hands tied and his feet tied, his eyes blindfolded, his head covered with a sweatshirt? Who would shoot him in the back 3 times? A coward? Go figure.
Early that next morning, Chris's body was discovered by I think a railroad or a trash employee that was outside, was it? And they realized he'd been shot, basically execution style. His body had been burned, and that's really when the public first started hearing about what had happened. His family had already noticed he was missing.
The killers set Chris's body on fire by railroad tracks after shooting him 3 times, once right against the head. They left him to die after setting the body on fire. A neighbor actually spotted smoke near the railroad tracks, we now assume from Chris's body, at around 7 or 7:30. About 12:15, 12:30, a railroad employee, as you say, an engineer, was passing and saw something that looked, the closer he got to it, like a body. Sure enough, when he got close enough, he realized it was a body. They stopped the train, and he notified authorities.
While Chris died early in the morning of the next day, the torture would just continue for Shannon, the hours that followed that.
That's right. Keep in mind they'd been carjacked late on January the 6th. She had been raped, we know for sure, by Cobbins and Davidson, because their sperm had been found on her.
This is not just a rape. This is the blunt trauma where an object comes in contact and severely damages the tissue. The depth of the injury was so grave that there's no way that just a regular rape could inflict this.
So she had endured hours of this, and the testimony indicated that she was trying to comply with them in hopes that she would live. They had no intention, obviously, in letting her live, and so they forced her into a trash can, hogtied her, and put her in the corner in this trash can with the lid over, and just let her die. She suffocated to death. Sadly, her eyes were open when she died. So we come to January the 9th. Knoxville police have finally secured a search warrant. They go over to the house. They walk into the kitchen. Nobody is there. Nobody is at the house. They walk around the house. They walk to the kitchen. One of the officers draws his gun because he sees that the trash can's got kind of an odd shape to it. There's like a bulge. Opens the lid, and there's a partial arm. He can see part of an arm, and he realizes we have a homicide.
At the time, there was still a little bit of hope out there that maybe Shannon was still alive. Her parents started looking for her car. I believe her father tried to ping her cell phone and found that location.
Didn't know at the time that she was 4 houses down from me.
It's really remarkable what happened. As you said, the family became concerned. Shannon was supposed to show up for work at Westtown Mall. She didn't. She wasn't there at noon when they thought she was supposed to be. So the family began talking to each other and saying, hey, we've got to do something. Shannon's mom then called the cell phone company and asked them to find the last time Shannon's phone had been used. The cell phone company came back and said it was at a Cherry Street tower. Cherry Street is very close to where LaMarcus Davidson's house was. As a result of that, the family got together with some friends and they organized a search, and they went street by street that day until hours later, in the middle of the night, they found her car.
And that's when police helped get involved with the family. They'd already been searching on their own. They looked in Shannon's 4Runner, and I believe they found a fingerprint on a piece of paper that was in the back of the car that led them to their next steps.
That's right. They showed up around 1:45 in the morning, about this. This would be now January the 8th, and a fingerprint expert finds this envelope, a financial, like a bank envelope on it, takes it and goes back to the lab to run tests on it and discovers, lo and behold, that there's a fingerprint on there that belongs to Lamarcus Davidson. He was a felon who had previously done prison time, so they already had prints on file, and very quickly they realized that they had a suspect who just happened to live very close to where Shannon's vehicle had been found.
We knew it was going to be hard. I feel so sorry for these kids, what they had to go through. It was very brutal, and the brutality of the crime just proves that there's more than just one person involved in this crime.
As soon as they'd realized the consequences of what they did, everybody scattered from the house. Davidson tried to hide out at his girlfriend's friend's apartment for a little while, but Boyd ultimately hid him in that house off Western Avenue. The three from Kentucky caught a ride back to Kentucky and stayed with a friend in Lebanon, but Knox County authorities soon figured out who they were, and it wasn't long before they too were being questioned and under arrest.
What would follow this would be weeks, months, years now of trials, of testimony. Eric Boyd was tried and found guilty in federal court. And then over the next 3 years, all four of the other suspects were also brought in. Let's talk a little bit about what, there is so much ground to cover, but where those defendants are right now.
So Boyd was the first to be tried, and he was indicted in federal court, accused of helping Davidson to hide in the days after the killings. And he did that. What he did is Davidson needed to get hidden, get out. He knew the cops were after him. His picture was showing up in the newspaper on television. So Boyd helped Davidson hide in an empty house off Western Avenue on a street called Reynolds Street. Gave him some food, would check in on him. The cops stopped Boyd, and he pretty quickly confessed that, yeah, he'd been helping him, and he led the police to where Davidson was hiding. Davidson was then arrested. Boyd was tried in April of 2008, convicted basically of helping Davidson to hide, and he was sent to federal prison. Next came the trials of all the people who had been in the house at the time of the torture-slayings. That was Davidson, the ringleader. That was his brother, Talvez Cobbins, who was from Kentucky. That was Cobbins' girlfriend, who was visiting also down from Kentucky. And that was their friend George Thomas, also from Kentucky. So you had these three folks from Kentucky who'd been staying in this tiny little house with Lamarcus Davidson.
In a shocking twist, tied to a little bit of bad behavior by the original judge, a round of retrials were ordered in 2011. That's kind of how you explained some of those same convictions stood. So years of court for these families, but there was always this lingering thing with Boyd. That brings us to what is happening right now. The family firmly believed he still had a role to play in both of their deaths. And we want to listen to a little piece of sound from Chris's father, Hugh Newsom, that he said early on in the trial.
I promised Chris when I embraced his form in the casket that I will be in court every time one of those suspects makes an appearance.
If the doors are open, we'll be there.
We recently spoke to Hugh, and he recounted something 300 times. He stopped counting how long he'd been in court.
Yeah, Hugh has been to every single hearing of any kind that has involved any of these defendants, not just the four who were in the house at Chipman Street, but also Eric Boyd. He has always been there. Mary's been there. They made a promise to Chris, and they have kept it.
Mm-hmm. Now, in April of 2018, a little over last year, the DA finally brought some state charges against Boyd for the first time, leading up to the trial that's going to start this week. Looking ahead, John, everything that's going to begin, we're going to begin with jury selection on the first day. For people that aren't familiar with court cases, can you talk a little bit about what that process is like, especially in such a high-profile criminal court like this?
Sure. Considering all the history which we've just talked about with this case, with the arrests in January of 2007, with all of the trials that we've had, you would think by now, 12 years having gone by, so much of this in the press, that we would probably bring a jury in from outside of Knox County. But that's not what's going to happen. The judge is confident, he says, that now, 12 years after the killings, he can find a panel of impartial Knox County people to hear the case. So what we're going to do starting Monday morning is determine who fits that description. All the jurors are going to fill out a questionnaire. They'll be asked how much they know about the case, and those who indicate they do have some knowledge will then be questioned individually. The hope is in the next couple days to get 16 people that they can then sit down and have listened to the facts. 12 ultimately will hear the case as the jury, but then they'll also have 4 in the bank, if you will, as alternates.
And not only will they hear the facts of this case, again, see photo evidence, listen to forensic analysts, they're going to hear from a lot of different testimonies. One of the ones to watch is George Thomas. Talk about his role and how this really could be the key to securing probably a successful trial for the families.
This is really significant because no defendant has ever testified against one of the other defendants before. They couldn't. When the police talked to, as I said, some of the men early on in the case, they gave information about Boyd, but Boyd wasn't on trial and it couldn't be used at that point. So now what's happened is it sounds like Hugh Newsom and Mary Newsom have convinced George Thomas to testify. George Thomas was in Davidson's house. He was there the night they brought Chris and Shannon back. He can talk about if he saw Eric Boyd walking into the house with Chris. He can talk about anything he knew, any kind of conversation that they had. Did Eric Boyd talk about what happened that night? Does George have specific information about the killings? That's all significant. We don't know because the state's really not said exactly. This could be the most significant new piece of evidence the state brings.
Now, one person we won't be hearing from is Talvez Cobbins. But, rewind years ago, Cobbins testified at his own trial. And earlier in the podcast, you mentioned he said some pretty significant things. The Newsoms were really hoping that he would be able to testify because of things he said during his own trial.
Talvez is the only person who's testified on his own behalf during his trial. His lawyer did not want him to do that. Interestingly, when it came time for Talvez to take the stand, his lawyer basically didn't ask a single question. He just basically said to Talvez, introduce yourself to the jury and say what you want to say. So for the next hour or so, Talvez described what happened that night. And as you said, something extremely significant that we know now, he talked about Eric Boyd helping in the carjacking. He also talked about seeing Eric Boyd walk back into the house with Chris Newsom.
Boyd comes in behind him, holding the guy. I noticed the guy has a bandana around his eyes, and his hands are tied behind him. Eric Boyd, he left the house. When he came back, he didn't have the guy with him, so I didn't know where the guy was. I didn't know what had happened to him.
Another interesting thing from Cobbins' trial was a forensic analyst also mentioned that the nature of Chris's injuries, it was very hard to believe that one person could be responsible.
Based upon your observations to Mr. Newsom's body, in your expert opinion, did one person commit all these injuries to Mr. Newsom?
The amount of injury and just the complexity of all the ties and just all the works done here, it's so extensive that for me it would be hard to imagine that one person could just do that.
It was a very violent crime. Chris was beaten. He was roughed up badly. He was raped. We know that semen was found on him, and it was not something that just one person would have done that night.
And John, we're going to be watching this really closely, keeping people updated through social media, on Facebook, online at WBIR.com, and following the trial. How long are you expecting you think this might last?
My guess is if they get a jury by Tuesday or Wednesday, it'll take a full 2 weeks. I think we should have a verdict probably at the end of 2 weeks. The jury's not sequestered, so they can go home at the end of the night. That also is kind of unusual. So they're going to be wanting to go home. They're not going to want to stay in a motel, so that will make them happy. But I would guess 2 weeks probably maximum. often these things we kind of overestimate how long we think it'll take, and it ends up being less time.
It's definitely going to be an interesting one to watch, and I think it's been a long time coming. No matter what the outcome is, I think the family has been waiting for this for a very long time.
Like you say, this has been something the families have wanted to do for a very long time, especially the Newsoms, because they have always suspected that Eric Boyd had more to do with killing their son than we realize. We don't know, with the evidence that's previously been introduced, we can't prove that Eric Boyd raped Chris. Maybe there's some new evidence, but the Newsoms have worked really hard on this case, and they have clearly worked hard to get George Thomas convinced to come to Knoxville. He's in prison now. To come to Knoxville, he can't get out of prison until he's in his 80s, to come to Knoxville and testify in this trial.
He's still with us. He's still a part of us, and that'll stay the same as long as we're here and alive. He'll be a part of us.
We were told from the get-go that this would be a lifelong commitment, and I made a promise to Shannon that I would fight till the day I die for justice for her and for Chris.